The dark surface of the gate's spell widened over the gravelly flats, between the yards piled high with timber and the now conspicuously drained marshes of the floodplain. It hovered there silently for a full minute, and Ludmilla furrowed her brow as she waited for something, for anything, to come out. Her finger tapped impatiently against her arm. With everything that was going on, the delay felt like it stretched on for an inordinate period of time. A snout eventually poked out, its olive scales glistening in the sunlight, nostrils testing the air. Then it stopped, remaining where it was, a single lizard-man snout, just floating in the air. Ludmilla's frown deepened. What would happen if the gate closed right then and there? She didn't get her chance to find out, however, as several vibrant green streaks shot out of the portal. Excited squeals filled the air as they darted about, and the hovering snout finally pushed through. "Wait!" a woman's voice cried out. Several other lizardmen spilt through, chasing after the green streaks. One of the streaks collided with Ludmilla's leg. A miniature lizardman, a lizardling, bounced off and went sprawling to the ground. The lizardman chasing it froze not 2 meters away, glancing up at Ludmilla, down to the figure lying at her feet and back again. The parent, probably? Ludmilla leaned over and reached down, stretching her hand out towards the lizardman child. No. Ludmilla looked back up at the woman's sorrowful cry. The lizardman, lizard woman? Held out some sort of object in front of her. Ludmilla frowned. What did it mean? Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a carved amulet, somewhat similar to the emblem found on the flag of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Is that supposed to do something? Ludmilla asked. The mother's jaw fell open upon hearing Ludmilla's reply. She glanced down one more time at her child, then threw herself flat to the ground. Mercy, she cried, mercy, please. She's only 6 months old, she didn't mean anything. The lizardmen exiting the gate gathered some distance away, their attention riveted on the unfolding scene. A few spoke quietly between themselves worriedly, while others held their hands before their half-opened mouths. A few covered their eyes as if some great tragedy was imminent. Well, you've certainly wasted no time instilling fear into your new subjects. Ludmilla turned her attention in the direction of the new voice. Lady Shaltir approached from the direction of the still-open portal, black parasol idly twirling over her left shoulder. Good afternoon, lady. As she went to curtsy, she found the lizardman child at her feet still, looking up at her with its huge eyes. She supposed that they were a bit cute in their own way. I think your mother wants you back. It blinked once before it got back up and tottered off. The mother snatched it once it got close enough and scurried away. Good afternoon, Lady Shaltir. Ludmilla was finally able to make a proper greeting. Good afternoon, Lady Zaradnik. Lady Shaltir smiled as she went to stand beside her. You seem to be off to a wonderful start with these immigrants. I'm not sure just what it is that I did. Ludmilla's gaze followed the fearful mother as she rejoined the other families that were arriving through the gate. She held up some sort of icon in my direction. Do you know what that was all about? Maybe she was trying to turn you? I'm reasonably certain that I cannot be turned, my lady. Do lizardmen even have clerics? They have those who hold the title of priest, Lady Shaltir said, but it seems that they're the druidic sort. If your objective wasn't to scare them witless, then perhaps you should stop looking like you're about to bite their heads off. Ludmilla sighed, massaging her face with her fingers in an effort to clear away whatever expression she had on her face. Ever since her return to Warden's Vale, the events of the morning caused her worries to sharply mount. She took several deep breaths to calm down, yet her agitation remained. As they watched the lizardmen continue passing through the gate with their belongings, a small frown appeared on Lady Shaltir's face. Are you all right, my lady? Ludmilla asked. I'm fine, Lady Shaltir answered. It's just that they're taking their sweet time. I was thinking that summoning some undead to carry all of their luggage would have been more mana efficient than holding the gate open for so long. I'll just have to keep it in mind next time I have to move people around. Thank you for your help with this, Ludmilla said. I wasn't sure how they were supposed to make their way over here all the way from the north. Moving things around is usually my job, anyways. Lady Shaltir waved her hand dismissively. I just hope no one catches on to the fact that I can move grain around like the other day. I don't mind helping you out, but if I had to do it for the entire duchy, I would be tied down for months. Well, I don't wish to impose on you any more than I absolutely need to. I don't think we'll have anything resembling proper shipyards for the next year or so, though. Maybe I should get to rebuilding the old bridge and laying down those new roads that Leanne and Clara have been working on with the dwarves. Chief Issess appeared out of the group of lizardmen gathering on the dried-out shore, walking up to stand before them. He dipped his head several times before speaking. Lady Shiltir, he said, Lady Zaradnik. We have completed moving all of our belongings. The gate closed, and Ludmilla looked past the lizardman chieftain at her new subjects. After some negotiation, the new Chief Issess had persuaded Lord Cocytus to allow 160 of the villagers from the Great Lake and Tob Forest to make the move. Are there any outstanding issues that require my attention, Chief Issess? Ludmilla asked. No, my lady, he replied. Well, they are mostly unsettled at the sight of the dry floodplain, though I explained what was going on in advance. I will put them to work right away. I will be in my manor this afternoon, should you need anything further, Ludmilla told him. Kestrus bobbed his head towards them one last time before turning around to see to his duties. Out of the corner of her eye, Ludmilla saw Lady Shiltir smiling slightly. Does something amuse you, my lady? Ludmilla asked. He's picking up your accent, the smile widened. Well, I suppose he would, Ludmilla said. I've been training him for weeks on everything he needs to know. Reading and writing were the first of it, though I'm not sure how he'd pick up my accent from learning Riastai's script. Ludmilla motioned for Lady Shiltir to accompany her to the manor, her need to be with her liege in private pressing her to the edge of what she would consider improper. Not that rushing would help her, the issues brewing to the south needed to be worked out thoroughly. What are your immediate plans for them? Lady Shiltir asked as they made their way to the harbour village. The marsh is still undergoing Lord Mayor's alterations, Ludmilla replied, so Chief Issess is having the construction of their homes done in advance. They should be in place before water is redirected onto its new course to refill the new lake and marsh. The ones not doing anything will be collecting the exposed bog ore all around the floodplain. Though there was still one last farming village that needed to have its landscaping done, the remaining water in the floodplain had flowed into the new lake that Lord Mayor had dug out in the north of the Vale. He was scheduled to finish his work over the next 2 weeks, including all of the changes they had discussed for the valley floor and the harbour town. With the goblin army flowing into the upper reaches, it felt decidedly odd to be under imminent attack yet still have land development proceeding apace. Mayor's alterations, Lady Shiltir looked towards the empty marsh. This entire thing seems quite ambitious. My heart would explode if I were to even think about any alterations to my domain, yet here you are doing all this at once. It's essentially the foundation for all development along the valley floor, my lady, Ludmilla said. Nothing will be able to begin down here until it is completed. HRN. Well, you know better than me when it comes to these things. Ludmilla snorted derisively. I wonder about that, she said. The more I learn, the more ignorant I feel. There are too many missing pieces that I require for future development. I think that I'll have to travel at some point to see how other nations do things. The Empire will probably be the first stop once things settle down here. If you're planning on heading there, Lady Shiltir told her, maybe you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Though they've become subordinate to us, there is an astonishing amount of resistance to the idea of undead labor. Perhaps adding a human touch would help. You're probably the best acquainted with the use of His Majesty's servitors when it comes to their various applications. I would be glad to help in any way I can, my lady, Ludmilla replied, but difficulties in adopting undead labor in the Empire are most likely less due to its practicality and more due to the stance of their temples. This again, huh? Lady Shiltir muttered. The temples of the 4 great gods in the Sorceress Kingdom are still clammed up after all this time. We're not even doing anything to them. You'd think that not being flattened despite their bigoted views would have them returning to regular operations after 4 months. Perceptions rooted in faith are hard to turn, Ludmilla said. The northern kingdoms are strongholds of the 4. It will take more than a handful of months of not being squashed by His Majesty's might to change their minds about a great many things. To sway the heart of the Empire, or even worse, Roble, would take a miracle of legendary proportions. Ludmilla felt Lady Shiltir fall behind, and she turned to see what was wrong. Lady Shiltir was standing on the village lane, looking up at her with a furrow on her brow. After a moment, she shook her head and resumed their ascent to the manor. There are no worries about low-tier undead, Lady Shiltir told her. It's the mid-tier undead, the Death Seer's servitors, in particular, that are collecting dust. Neighboring nations just uniformly balk at our offer. Collecting dust. Her liege's words fanned the embers of anger that she had been trying to stifle until they returned to her manner. She cleared her throat before speaking, just in case any of it leaked out. "I'm not surprised, my lady," Ludmilla said. "Death Seer's summons and soul eaters would be an untenable risk to nearly every nation. They are fundamentally His Majesty's creations, so a country must consider what would occur if they were turned against them for any reason." "Preposterous," Lady Sheltier sniffed. "If we wanted to use our forces against them, we wouldn't be wasting time trying to lease them out." "I suppose it's the principle of it. A dependency on foreign security carries substantial risks, while also being a blow to national pride." "Well, I still think it's worth the attempt," Lady Sheltier told her. "You have a certain way about you that inspires the confidence of others. It's quite insidious." Ludmilla did not believe that she was doing anything insidious. If anything, she was just putting her best effort into things and trying to be as genuine as she could while she clumsily felt her way forward. Lady Sheltier's parasol vanished before they entered the manor, and they made their way to the table in the living area. Willuvian and Nonna lowered their heads at her approach. "Welcome, Lady Sheltier," Willuvian said. Lady Sheltier acknowledged their greeting before turning her attention to the map on the table. "Oh, so this is our invasion." "To be honest, my lady, I'd rather it be someone else's invasion at the moment." "Come now, Ludmilla," Lady Sheltier smiled, "this is right up your alley, yes? Take it from me, things can get too quiet, and it can become quite unbearable. You just sit there, twiddling your thumbs and praying for a chance to prove your worth as a defender of the realm." "That might be the case if I felt I was ready to be tested," Ludmilla admitted, "but this timing is simply obnoxious. It's as if they were waiting for just this point in time to rear their ugly heads." Such was the crux of her frustrations. At the urging of Lady Sheltier, Lady Aura, and Lord Mayor, she had taken up the management of the entire southwestern border, the former holdings of the other frontier lords. The change was so recent that all she had was a map from Lady Aura and a few ideas about how to defend it tumbling about in her imagination. She certainly did not have anything that resembled a comprehensive defensive scheme for the entire border. The only saving grace was that Aura's maps reassured her that the only way north into the duchy was a series of passes that crossed the gap between the range to her east and the rest of the southern border ranges. Unfortunately, that gap was also nearly 80 kilometers across. "You know," Lady Sheltier murmured, "I've seen these pieces from somewhere before." "Really?" Ludmilla said, "Well, it is a fairly widespread game. The pieces just ended up being used for the map since I don't have any proper markers yet. I originally imported a bunch of things in an attempt to provide some sort of quiet recreation for my subjects. There are things to do aplenty outdoors, but we're far from the city in terms of this sort of thing." "So you don't play?" "It's a popular game amongst the inner nobility," Ludmilla replied, "but I'm not much for it." "That's surprising. I figured a militant noble would love this sort of thing." "A militant noble would be too busy doing the real thing. The inland nobility, at least those with fanciful aspirations to militancy, are the ones that love it. They believe that being able to best others at this game reflects their tactical and strategic acumen. They especially love to play against my father or my brothers, since it apparently proved them superior to us in a field that we were supposed to be experts in." "Then why did you bring this game in if you hate it so much?" "It's not that I hate it," Ludmilla said, "I just don't think it's in any way an accurate representation of even the lightest skirmish. The real world is not a perfectly flat board with perfectly fashioned spaces. We never see everything our opponents do, or our allies, for that matter. People don't always move exactly as you want or expect them to, and the results between combatants are never so arbitrary. There are barely any logistical elements to this game, and, well, it's just idle entertainment, at best." There was a tapping noise, and Nonna went to retrieve the bone vulture that was pecking away at the door. She and Willuvian set about updating the map. Over the course of the morning, 7 new goblin encampments had appeared, and Ludmilla wondered if it would slow down any time soon. After updating the map, Nonna left to attend to matters around the village, bringing the bone vulture with her. After the door quietly closed, Ludmilla broached the pressing topic that she wanted to address. "My lady," Ludmilla said, "is my perception of His Majesty's undead forces skewed in some way?" "How do you mean?" After taking a look at what was entering the basin last night, I had a form requesting additional forces submitted to the administration in Erantal. It was rejected within the hour, saying that what I possessed was already more than sufficient to deal with what was described in the report I attached to the request. I believe you have 11 Death Knights here. Lady Shiltir tapped her chin lightly. That should be more than sufficient, no? Nonna said much the same thing, Ludmilla replied. Even after going over my rationale with her, I'm not sure if she agrees. It's said that Death Knights can destroy a small country, but I feel that this idea is used as an arbitrary and irrational measure of what is required for any given situation. Lady Shiltir took a sip from the tea that Willuvian had laid out for them, looking down at the map for several moments before speaking. You realize that you're possibly the only human that has come up to the administration and stated that nearly a dozen Death Knights are insufficient for your purposes, yes? I can imagine one of those elder liches choking on its own dust as it reviewed your request. It was a frank assessment of the situation, Ludmilla said. I am duty-bound to do so. Have you read the report? No, I was in Fioberkane earlier this morning, Lady Shiltir replied, then I went to deliver the lizardman after that. Just looking at what you have here, however, I do not see any issues. Your family has defended this place for generations. Why do you believe that there will be any problems now? It's because we've been conducting our defense in a particular way since the establishment of our house, Ludmilla said, but in the present circumstances, this strategy will fail. Lady Shiltir furrowed her brow, looking down at the map as if to discern why such a statement had been made. When her gaze returned to Ludmilla, the confusion over her features only grew. I won't pretend to have any great knowledge of strategy, she said, but what you claim doesn't make much sense to me. Actually, I believe that it wouldn't, to most. The forces at your disposal are far beyond what your family has worked with in the past, so you should have an easier time of it, no? Ludmilla felt her mouth twitch at her liege's words, and she pressed her lips into a thin line. It was a mode of thinking reminiscent of times past, when her family petitioned Erantal for assistance in dealing with outstanding threats. Beyond her own memories, it was something that previous generations of her house had also been subjected to. If they could defend the frontier with a few dozen villagers, then surely offering funds to refurbish equipment or maybe even hire adventurers would solve the problem. Sometimes, they just offered vagrants picked up off of the street to replace their losses, thinking that the inhabitants of the Vale were no different than any other of the small folk of the interior. It was a fundamental difference in their respective realities. The safe and secure lords well away from the threats of the frontier were incapable of grasping even the smallest fragment of what was involved in maintaining the security of the border. Like the games that had them fancy themselves masters of warfare, they saw the world as a board where their mastery could be exercised the exact same way. A few of the more brash nobles even suggested that they could take over House Saradnik's duties since her family was obviously full of incompetence. In response, her parents quietly took the offerings of material and manpower with thanks, understanding that it was better than nothing. They never, however, entertained any overblown aspirations to command the border. Feeling that she and Lady Shiltir shared many similar attitudes, she assumed that her new liege would also understand her dilemma, at least in part, so it was somewhat disappointing to hear that very same line of thinking from her. Ludmilla lightly tapped her fingers on the table, wondering what she could say. Perhaps Lady Shiltir did not see the issue because she was unfathomably powerful in her own right, and she probably had much more powerful forces protecting her domain as well. A difference in perception due to an unbridgeable gap in strength. Shaking herself out of the mire of bitter memories, she decided that she should at least communicate her point of view. My lady, Ludmilla said, you once told me that there is an irreconcilable chasm that exists between a faithful vassal that stands in her eternal vigil at the edge of the realm, and one who sits comfortably at the right hand of her sovereign. That, even if everything functions as expected, sometimes it is simply not enough, and that plans drawn from raw intellect may be mercilessly scattered to the wind. I recall saying something like that, yes. Then, if I may, I would like to address what appears to be a chasm of its own that currently lies between us. Though we are both faithful defenders of His Majesty's realm, the sheer difference in strength, or perhaps the nature of our respective territories, results in a difference in perception. I also hear and see it in how His Majesty's servants conduct themselves, and I sense that these differences are present at all levels of the Sorceress Kingdom's administration and military thinking. from the missives and policies of the royal court to the commentary of the elder liches. I even see it in the official forms for requesting military assets. You have no need to step around so lightly with me, Lady Shaltier told her. You did swear to provide me with honest counsel, after all. Yes, my lady, Ludmilla lowered her head. Then, actually, her liege held up a hand. I will rephrase that. Explain your thoughts to me in a way that I will be able to understand. I've had it about up to here with others in the royal court speaking in references and roundabout ways that fly right over my head. They actually did that? It didn't seem like a good way for the executive officers of the government to communicate at all. What if it resulted in miscommunication or someone didn't get what was going on at all? At the least, it was an ongoing problem for Lady Shaltier, by her own admission. There are some more straightforward ideas that shouldn't require further elaboration, Ludmilla said. For one, there's never been a goblin army this large before in the history of the upper reaches. Much smaller armies have appeared in the past, but our cooperative relationship with the theocracy on the other side of the basin has always resulted in us collaborating with their forces when threats beyond a certain degree and severity appeared. She paused in her explanation to wait for any questions Lady Shaltier might have. Her liege pulled out her green notepad and started writing. After a minute, she nodded slowly and gestured for her to continue. For the long-term strategy House Ziradnik has employed in our everyday defense of the border, I suppose a story might convey the general sense of the idea. A story? Yes, a story, Ludmilla replied. A centuries-old tale, related to us when we were young. It's actually from a nation deep in the great desert far to the south, a place even more distant than my family's ancestral home. I know I asked for something easy to understand, a dubious expression painted over Lady Shaltier's face, but I feel that the bar you've set for me has been lowered further than where I intended if you're resorting to children's tales. Well, it was meant to be instructional, both of my parents knew a version of it. Fine. But if it ends with "and they lived happily ever after," I'm going to bite you. Ludmilla couldn't figure out whether Lady Shaltier was joking or not. She was probably joking. When was the last time she refilled that bottle of blood? She took a sip of her tea, trying to figure out how to relate the old tale. There was once a great commander, Ludmilla began, who was respected and feared for his cunning tactics and intricate stratagems far and wide. On a certain campaign, he found himself positioned poorly in a fortress city against an enemy army 30 times the size of his own. Rather than giving in to despair, or doing his best to organize a hopeless defense, he devised a daring scheme. He hid his soldiers and told the citizens to go about their daily business inside the city. When the enemy army sent its scouts to gather information on the city, they only noted this great commander standing on top of the gatehouse, singing a silly children's song. I don't get it. Lady Shaltier frowned. Ludmilla's lips turned up in a smile, recalling her father's own when she said the exact same thing. Neither did the scouts, she said, but they returned to their generals and reported their findings, as was their duty. The generals conferred with one another, each as confused as the other. In the end, they decided it was some unfathomable ploy laid by this famously devious enemy commander, so they bypassed the city. So this great commander survived, just like that? He did. That's ridiculous, Lady Shaltier scoffed. When the enemy generals eventually found out, Ludmilla said, they were understandably furious, but it was too late. Ludmilla looked down at the map before them, gesturing broadly at the northern passes. The defensive wardens veil over the generations puts into practice the principles put forward by this tale. Our activity on the border is purposely and painstakingly maintained. All intruders who enter, perish. No one is permitted to escape. We are an unfathomable, unknowable threat that no enemy survives, and our lush and inviting land lends to the idea that it is an insidious trap where only death awaits those that succumb to its allure. Ludmilla reached out and picked up a game piece from the side of the table. That is why this, she held it up in front of her, is child's play. Even our day-to-day routines are more intricate. Every patrol, warning, trap, ambush or lack thereof is part of a grand illusion that manipulates the preconceptions of the wilderness tribes and inexorably binds them to a construct composed of their own fears. For that very same reason, we do not attack the tribes to the south unless we must, to avoid giving our neighbors any sense of our true nature. To maintain this illusion, we kill what we must, and we sacrifice what we must. She put the piece back down on the map again, where she predicted that the next encampment would be discovered. They were creeping out like vines, embracing the rivers and ravines at predictable intervals. At this rate, they would occupy the majority of the basin in a few days. Rather than directly pitting strength against strength like so many would-be commanders, Ludmilla said, we leveraged what strength we had in a way that provided the most effective results. As a result, we have raised a wall that is far more cost-effective in terms of lives and resources than the Great Wall of Roblé. Like any wall, however, holes will appear when sufficient force is brought to bear against it. So, Lady Shiltir looked up from writing, you're saying that this goblin army will not be deterred by this wall that you've relied upon for generations? That is a part of it, yes, Ludmilla nodded. Since they are newcomers, they will not possess the same history as the tribes of the upper reaches, and I doubt that the fears of the local tribes will much affect the decisions of the hobgoblins commanding an army so large. In the past, newcomers would occasionally do the same thing, but we possessed sufficient strength to intercept and destroy them, thus enforcing the shadow of dread we cast over the rest. And you can't do that with the undead forces at your disposal? Lady Shiltir asked. Ludmilla reached out and picked up some white-colored game pieces from the side of the map, placing them in their defensive positions. Of the strong undead servitors at my disposal, she said, I have 11 Death Knights. Of those forces, I can free up to 5 Death Knights at most. The golems are for civilian construction, and the Death Warrior is busy operating the ship. The Elder Liches are an option, but I am loath to use them. The ones that came after Nonna are much weaker than she is. I can probably destroy one myself, or at least come close to doing so in this sort of environment. They would be best used defending the villages along with the skeletal undead placed on the walls, but I would consider it a failure of my duties if intruders were allowed to get that far. Why would that be a failure of your duties? Lady Shiltir frowned. As long as your enemies are vanquished, this would be considered a success, yes? Is that how it works in your personal domain? Of course. Intruders can run around all they wish. The defensive layout of my territory is designed specifically for just that. As long as I get them all in the end, it's my win. Ludmilla frowned. She was starting to become curious about Lady Shiltir's territory. She had heard of defenses that were designed in such a way that breaches were both expected and anticipated, but never had she heard of any schemes that allowed invaders to run rampant over vast amounts of important territory. But what if they get past you? She asked. Won't the territories further inland be at risk? What about your duties? They would have to step over my dead body to advance into the next territory, Lady Shiltir answered. If they did, well, they would be in for a long swim through the underground lake. Gargantua would be dealing with them then. This doesn't happen often, does it? There's only been one major incursion in the past. An army of invaders managed to get through me, Gargantua, Cocytus, Aura, Mare, and Demiurge. Just how in the, did they take some route that circumvented your territories? Oh, no, there's no way around, so they just fought their way through, but then the forces commanded by Auriol annihilated them. Her statement beggared the imagination. Just who were the Sorceress Kingdom's enemies? Considering the age of Lady Aura and Lord Mare, the invasion Lady Shiltir described should have been recent, but such a calamitous conflict would have surely been known the world over. Even the tale of the 8 Greed Kings was still widespread after nearly 5 centuries, and she thought that the Sorcerer King's servants might be as strong as they. Auriol, the human commander you mentioned back then? Yes, that's right, Lady Shiltir smiled. It's my hope that you'll become something like her in the future. This feels like a very lofty goal, my lady. Well, keep at it. In the future, I'm sure you'll laugh at the memory of your worries here. At any rate, we've digressed. What was it that you wanted to say? Ludmilla blinked, trying to figure out where they had left off. The expectations that accompany your defensive duties appear to be a bit different from my own, she said. The foremost duty of a frontier noble is to keep the border secure against external threats. Nobles in general are granted land by their liege with the expectation that they will develop it into a productive territory and contribute to the growth of the realm. Having demi-human invaders freely running around my territory or even striking off inland is decidedly counter to those duties. That's understandable enough, I think. These human territories are so terribly fragile compared to our own. I've made the effort to mitigate that somewhat, Ludmilla said, but the best option is to not allow the chance for harm at all. There's also another problem, which might be unique to my domain.
What's that? Lady Shaltir asked.
Nearly all of the humans here, Ludmilla answered, including me, are followers of the 6 great gods. We might have grown to become more tolerant than our brothers and sisters in the faith to the south, but, by and large, we do not possess a generally positive outlook when it comes to non-humans. I've been tasked to integrate the lizardmen into my domain, and more demi-humans may move into the territory. This is already a monumental challenge. Having other demi-humans running around causing mayhem will cripple any efforts to fulfill His Majesty's desire to promote good relations between the peoples that will come to live here. So invasion by this army is something you cannot risk at all. How about adding the skeletal laborers and bone vultures to your border defenses? They are still essentially fighting forces, even if they're not being used for other things. There are so few that they cannot be used as a reliable force. From what I've seen of them, the skeletal laborers are somewhere around the strength of a lightly armed gold-rank adventurer, while the bone vultures are a bit stronger than that. Looking back down to the map, Ludmilla pointed to the growing number of markers indicating goblin encampments. Hobgoblins are some of the most unwelcome of threats that can befall a border territory, she said. They don't just gather other goblinoids to them, they train them as well, turning them into soldiers that can be just as strong as Imperial legionnaires. My baseline assumption is that everything out there is equivalent to a silver rank adventurer or better. Though their equipment is most likely crude, they will still have rudimentary martial arts, quite a number of magic casters, and a mix of irregular forces made out of the other races that they've managed to pick up along the way. I see, Lady Shaltir nodded lightly. So you're saying that the other undead forces in your domain are too close to these goblins in strength, so they can easily be overwhelmed by the sheer number of them? That's right. The best I can hope for when it comes to them is to form a single contingent out of the skeletal laborers and set them to defend some position. The bone vultures are being used for limited reconnaissance and can be organized into groups that harry loose enemy forces if need be. There's also the chance that they have some flying monsters like manticores or griffins that they've tamed and turned into aerial forces, so I need to hold a few dozen in reserve. Death Knights are the only reliable defenders I have in this situation, and having only 5 means that I cannot hold the border properly.
Why do you say that? Lady Shaltir asked.
Ludmilla gestured to the stretch of territory bordering the Vale that the demi-humans were most likely to approach. Because I have an 80-kilometer stretch of mountain passes that I need to defend along this border, Ludmilla answered, assuming they don't somehow crawl over the mountains further west. As powerful as our Death Knights are, they can only be in one place at any one time. Our opponents won't be conveniently queuing up for the Death Knights to kill them. Tens of thousands of them might be coming through passes 5 to 10 kilometers across. Most will make it in, and once they get into the forests on the other side, the Death Knights won't be able to find them. Seeing my fortified villages, they may also just decide to move on to raid the territories further inland, which would be an absolute debacle. I'll admit that this isn't a problem that I have with my realm, Lady Shaltir said. Any way in is narrow and clear enough that something like a Death Knight would have no issues holding any of the routes against these goblins. With the knowledge that the administration has rejected your request for additional forces,
what was your plan?
Ludmilla pointed down to the markers placed in the middle of each pass. This, pretty much, she said. I doubt they'll come through the canyon, but I can't risk it. This effectively leaves me with 4 Death Knights for 4 passes. Since His Majesty has explicitly prohibited us from performing acts of unwarranted aggression against our neighbors, all I can do is wait and see if they'll give me an excuse to retaliate.
Retaliate? Yes, Ludmilla replied. Retaliate.
I cannot afford to wait for them to swarm in, but I also cannot preemptively attack them due to our national policy, which I am obliged to uphold. The next best option is to go on the offensive after I am provided with justification to do so. Meaning you'll lead your forces out into the wilderness and attack the goblin army. To be honest, it's not something that we would normally consider. Unless we're performing some duty for His Majesty, or we perceive that some great danger has befallen him beyond our borders, defense of the realm is the order of the day.
I didn't note any amendments to the Crown laws that state this, Ludmilla said.
Is it some sort of unspoken rule or custom?
A custom, perhaps?
Lady Shaltir replied. Our realm is defensive in nature, and leaving it to go on the offensive against potential invaders is unheard of.
How would this apply to me? As long as you do not run afoul of the laws laid out for His Majesty's subjects, I suppose that you're free to enact whatever measures you wish. This wilderness is unclaimed by any nation, so your actions will be unrestricted out there. Ludmilla crossed her arms, trying to figure out the best course of action as she stared down at the map of the upper reaches. Her entire plan hinged on the goblin army sending something to scout out the passes. Undead were reviled almost universally, so the chance was nearly guaranteed that at least one skirmish on the border would occur before they realized just how tough Death Knights were and opted to evade them instead. She would need to keep as many scouting parties from returning to report as possible, then stop any small warbands that attempted to cross the pass after something eventually made it back to their commanders. In that small window of opportunity, her retaliation would have to disorder the nearest goblin encampments enough to arrest their momentum. With the forces on hand, however, the main avenue she had to accomplish this would be to silence the encampments one at a time, and she doubted that it would be effective enough to suit her purposes. Maybe there were alternatives. What about the goblin army that's stationed around Carney village? Ludmilla said, would diplomacy be possible through them? They're an entirely different population, Lady Shiltier said. Do humans all get along just because they're all humans? She figured that would be the case. Demi-humans warred between one another just as much, no, probably more, than they did with humans. Since the build-up in the upper reaches represented a threat to the theocracy as well, perhaps she could coordinate something with them. The more I think about it, Lady Shiltier's voice interrupted her thoughts, the more I fancy this idea of going out and making a mess out of these goblins. You do? Yes, she nodded, but I won't deprive you of your duty. I have a better idea of your position now, but I still can't override the administration's decision. How about I lend you a few of my vassals? Ludmilla turned her attention away from the map, looking to Lady Shiltier beside her. You would do this for me, my lady? It is within the bounds of our contract, is it not? Yes, my lady. Then, well, nothing too strong. Below Death Knights in strength. No dragons. The idea that dragons may have been an option hadn't even crossed Ludmilla's mind. One would certainly wreak havoc if they had no way to answer being attacked from the air. Then, Ludmilla said, if you don't mind, the 3 shadow demons that worked with us in Facet County. I did say a few, Lady Shiltier frowned, but is that enough? You were panicking over not having more than a dozen Death Knights on top of everything else. Yes, Ludmilla replied with a smile. The Death Knights were the best option presented by the request forms, so I required a great number of them to conduct an appropriate defense in a place that suited their strengths. I will, of course, accept any additional assistance you would be willing to offer, but, with a few shadow demons, the scope of what I can accomplish will broaden immeasurably. You're up, kiddo. But, a fist came in and bashed Nob on the arm. Nob let out a pained yelp, stumbling forward. As Nob nursed what would probably be a bruise in a few minutes, Nob glanced back and realized that Nob was dead. Dead. Big dead. Stupid Hob, deading Nob. If only they had never come. With the back of one hand, Nob scrubbed a tear off of Nob's cheek, glowering down at the driven stake that Nob had just stumbled past. Piled around it were skulls, goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, ogres, gnolls, trolls, all types of skulls, one for each of the races that lived, or once lived, in the basin. It was one of many markers that warned the tribes living in the area that beyond lay a grim fate. If you crossed the threshold and were one of the races in the pile, you were marked for death. Nob told them. Nob warned them. Stupid hobs. They came from the west, with their big army and big weapons and big, stupid heads. They killed the old boss and told Nob and Nob's tribe to join. Nob had fun for a few days, but then the hobs told Nob that they were going north. Many others told them that going north was stupid, but stupid hobs were stupid. Humans were weak, they said. Humans weren't civilized enough to mark their borders like that, they said. The hobs had their big everything, so of course, they became stupid. The hobs took Nob north with them, saying that they valued what Nob knew about the land. They wanted Nob for what Nob knew, but they didn't listen to what Nob knew. Stupid hobs. Now, Nob was dead. Hey kid, what are you standing there for? Nob looked up at the rough voice prodding Nob forward. It was a big hob named Zrol, one of the army bosses. Zrol and Zrol's soldiers stood on the other side of the marker, looking at Nob expectantly. Nob swallowed.
Maybe it wasn't too late. Once in a while, hunters would chase a rabbit across the markers a little bit and come back safe and sound.
Nob not want.
Huh?
No go.
You've got a job to do, soldier, Zroll told him. Just head up that pass, then come back and tell us what you saw. The hob boss cranked a mean-looking crossbow even as the hob spoke in a nice voice. It made a soft click, and Zroll's hand moved to fetch a bolt from the bag at Zroll's waist. They used nice big words to impress Nob, make Nob feel important, but Nob knew Nob was just fodder. Nob darted uphill towards the pass before Zroll raised the weapon. Dead, 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 dead. The words in Nob's mind sounded in time with the patter of frantic footsteps. Wait, Nob shouldn't be walking out in the open. Nob scuttled into the trees. Dead, 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 dead. Nob's steps slowed. The higher Nob went, the more sparse the trees and bushes became. Nob raised Nob's nose and sniffed at the air. Humans. Yup, they were still there, their scent carried by the winds from the north. The scent was much stronger now. Were there more? Why did the hobs have to kill Nob? Dead, 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 dead. Nob went forward, trying to find a way with more trees up the pass. Nob didn't want to die yet. Maybe Nob could hide inside a bush and wait until Zroll went away. Maybe the humans wouldn't find Nob. Dead, 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 dead. Nob looked around. Nob was far past the marker. Eyes darting around, Nob looked down at the bald stones of the pass. Nearer to Nob, the leaves of the bushes moved silently in the wind. Something hit Nob. Nob went flying into the trunk of a tree, hitting Nob's head. Through blurred vision, Nob thought Nob saw a shadow approach, shifting through the brush. Nob's sight cleared and the shadow became a tall thing. A forest giant? No, the humans deaded them all long ago. The humans. Human? Nob stared over at the shadow in the trees. It was a human. At least it smelled like the human smell on the wind. Why was it so huge? As it stalked forward, Nob looked around for Nob's spear, but Nob must have dropped it. Nob's bow was broken. Nob's rear had landed on it. Nob felt around the strip of leather tied around Nob's waist and found an old friend. It was Nob's rock. A trusty weapon Nob had used to kill many birds, rats and squirrels. Also, it was a rock made out of stone. With the stone rock, Nob might be able to win. The human reached down. Nob moved to get up and surprise the human, but it was faster than Nob had expected. A cold, cruel hand wrapped itself around Nob's scrawny neck, and Nob found himself lifted high up in the air. Humans, weak? Stupid hob was stupid, humans were stupid strong. The human was holding Nob up so high with just a single hand. Nob hit the human with all of Nob's might, but the stone rock only glanced off. There was a dull metal shell over the human's arm. That wasn't fair. Nob kicked and flailed away, but the choking grasp only tightened around Nob's neck. Out of breath, Nob hung limply in the air. The stone rock fell out of Nob's shaking hand. Nob was dead. Stupid hobs, deading Nob. If only they had never come. The world. Nob was flying through the air again. Was this death? No, it was fluffy. Fluffy like the old boss's bear hide blanket. Maybe death was fluffy. Nob looked up and saw a giant feline head looking back down with flaring, crimson eyes. Nob's mouth fell open in a terrified shriek. It was only then that Nob realized that the world had long gone silent. As the days went by, Ludmilla quietly tracked the progress of the goblin army as it spread across the upper reaches. As expected of the disciplined and militant nature of their hobgoblin commanders, they advanced in an orderly and predictable way while they carried out what was probably their established routine. Encampments were placed roughly 5 kilometers apart from one another, following sources of water. At each new camp, they would dispatch goblin scouts to investigate the surrounding area before sending soldiers forward to start the next. Local demi-human tribes were either pressed into service or turned into food. Many fled east, ahead of the advancing army, causing all manner of chaos in the basin. So far, none had attempted crossing over the northern passes. At home, she was not idle either. Immediately after Lady Shiltir departed, she had a warning scribe to be delivered to the cathedral in Nerantal, who would, in turn, pass the information on to the slain theocracy. She wasn't sure how long the South would take to mobilize, but any relief from that side would be welcome. Warnings were also sent directly to Count Volkenheim, Countess Jesn, and Countess Corlin, as their territories were at risk should the advancing goblin army break through in their direction. The royal court was, of course, provided updates, but there was no hint of any action being taken by the administration yet. Several orders to the various businesses in Erantal were also sent out, including a request for additional alchemical supplies from Germaine Linez. While the Goblin army was initially making its way into the upper reaches, she also took the time to visit each of the farming villages in turn. Rather than offering empty reassurances, she told them exactly what was going on in the upper reaches and what her expectations were. Hopefully, letting them know would cement the idea that staying within the safety of their villages was in their own best interests. On a more positive note, the magical ateliers run by the newly arrived Cernorn members reported that their products were being sold as quickly as they were being made. Isabella suggested that it was mostly due to the villagers being trapped within their respective walls and looking for curiosities to satisfy their boredom. Since their logistics were being handled entirely by undead servitors, the movement of supplies between the harbor and the villages remained uninterrupted. Overall, it seemed that her subjects were treating it as a sort of holiday where they spent their harvest earnings on items and furniture for their homes, as well as socializing with their fellow villagers. One of Ludmilla's concerns before the demi-humans started to arrive in the upper reaches was that the farmers might hoard their earnings, so it was a relief to her that money was starting to circulate in her domain. Ludmilla supposed things could have been much worse. She had half expected mass panic from the mix of city folk and other denizens of the inner territories, but perhaps they were so detached from the threats of the border that they were essentially oblivious to them. Another part of her wondered if it was due to the subtle influence that she had over her subjects at large. It was a rather reckless attitude to take for purely civilian villagers. If it were Easties, it would have been decidedly suicidal. Looking back, she thought it was perhaps the core of what made the villagers of Warden's Vale so stoic in the first place, and the breakdown of that state due to the loss of her father and her refusal at the time to take up the mantle of lordship. During her overall preparations, one troublesome issue was the matter of the third village, which was still undergoing construction. Though the village buildings were mostly complete, the walls were not even started yet. In the end, she divided its population between the two completed villages, having them either share living space with smaller families or stay in the as of yet unoccupied service buildings around the market square. Doing so freed up the pair of Death Knights assigned to the third village, bringing her total available number up to 7. Lady Shiltier's promised vassals arrived the same night she left, as well, 6 shadow demons. Her liege had sent her the 3 that had assisted in Facet County, plus 3 more for the Lynham sisters to train in the same manner as the first set. She was uncertain what she would ever need 6 shadow demons for, but maybe they were to be used elsewhere. Willuvian and Leluvian happily went to work, providing her with intelligence on the Goblin army's composition, the way their camps were arranged, and even some of their movements. In the time that she had taken to make her preparations, the Goblin army had split into 2 separate arms, each following one of the rivers flowing down from the west. The southern arm had already occupied the southern half of the central valley, while the northern arm was behind due to their later start. Ludmilla felt that it was an ideal time to strike. The northern arm would be in an overextended position until they came around to meet with what appeared to be the main body of the Goblin army in the central valley. Surmising that the hobgoblins would continue with their orderly routine, she sent a dozen bone vultures to monitor the string of camps that appeared to be creeping their way up to the western passes. She set additional bone vultures just in case new encampments were being made in the direction of the eastern passes, then others to see if the army continued to progress towards the Katza River and back down the central valley to complete their logistical loop. Now, all she needed to do was wait for the goblins to come to her. After waiting in a sheltered crag above the western passes for 18 hours, a bone vulture arrived to deliver the report she was hoping for, a small group of hobgoblins and goblins leaving the closest encampment, heading north towards the westernmost pass. She stretched her cramped muscles and hopped onto Nonna's shoulders, and together they flew off to see what the evening would bring them. 2 hours later, Ludmilla spotted movement in the trees below. She ordered the 2 Death Knights at the top of the pass to pull back and out of sight. "It looks like our first guest has arrived," she told Nonna. "Cast invisibility on us and descend to about 100 meters over the ground." The Elder Lich complied with her orders, and a ghostly film superimposed itself over the both of them. Ludmilla held up her hand to study it, then looked down at Nonna. "If someone has an invisibility effect on them," she asked, "can they see other invisible people?" it would still require something that confers the ability to see invisible persons.
That seemed annoying. She scanned the surroundings as they descended, looking for any other scouts. I am keeping track of this one.
Fly us over the pass and see if there are any others. After an hour flying back and forth, Ludmilla decided that the lone goblin was the only one, a sacrifice to test the rumors that the invading hobgoblins had undoubtedly heard about Warden's Vale from the locals.
There does not appear to be anything. Time to head back and see where our little goblin friend has gone. They found it not far from where they had left it, carefully picking its way up the slope. It went from bush to bush, searching for groups of trees to advance between. Every few minutes, it stopped to look around nervously. Judging from its appearance, it was not a very important goblin. It held a wooden spear in one hand and a crude shortbow in the other. Aside from that, it only had a loincloth that was practically a tattered leather rag. Ludmilla tapped her chin as they followed the goblin on its meandering journey up the pass. Of the goblin forces observed, the hobgoblins appeared to have some semblance of proper equipment. The rest were divided between haves and have-nots. Stronger-looking bugbears and goblins appeared to be decently equipped by tribal standards, while the weaker ones were armed like the one below. If it was one of the ones native to the upper reaches, there was a chance that she could make use out of it. She looked ahead, trying to predict the goblin's future course. Head over above that group of pines, about 5 meters from the ground. Silent cast silence on me when the goblin gets there. Leave the spell with its default radius, I will be dropping down after you cast it. The Elder Lich flew over to the place that Ludmilla indicated, and she checked the ground below. It seemed safe enough to land on. The goblin eventually made its way forward, and the world suddenly became silent. Ludmilla leaned backwards off of Nonna's shoulders. She tumbled over in the air before landing on her feet. Sneaking up behind the goblin, she reached out to grasp the end of its spear, then lashed out with her foot. It was a basic strike art that drove an opponent back more than anything else, but it was enough to send the goblin flying headfirst into a nearby tree. Ludmilla tossed the crude spear aside, walking up to the goblin who lay there in a daze. The demi-human looked up at her with unfocused eyes, and she leaned over to pick it up. It tried to move as she did so, but she grabbed it by the neck before it got too far. Ludmilla held it out at arm's length, wrinkling her nose at the smell as it kicked and flailed and doggedly struck her bracer with a rock. Ludmilla looked up in the direction of the pass. "Send your squire zombie over here." After some time, the Chrono squire zombie appeared. The goblin had ceased its struggles by then, and she tossed it over to the squire zombie. "Hold on to this guy, don't let him escape." The goblin came to shortly after being caught, and Ludmilla thought its eyes would come out of its sockets as it screamed up at the sight of the undead Chronos zombie. No sound issued from the goblin, nor any other sounds, for that matter, due to the silence spell blanketing the area around Ludmilla, but it kept screaming nonetheless. Eventually, the goblin fainted again and lay still. Ludmilla gestured up towards Nonna, and sound returned to the world. "We're going back to the far side of the pass," she said. "Time to find out what we can do with this guy."